Great. Hi, everybody. I can't see anybody, so if anything goes wrong, someone's going to have to open up and let me know. Thanks, Sam, for that. A lot to think about. As ever, it's kind of a bit of an information overload, all this stuff. So I'm just going to I have so much I kind of want to say about this that it's going to be hard to compress it, but I'll just do it anyway. And I think that just to start with, this talk is in two parts, but I'm reminded by Sam's talk that I trained as a graphic designer and illustrator in the 1980s, and I got into critical theory when I was doing that. And then I started to ask questions about, the difference between the arts and the avant-garde arts and commercial arts, because that was kind of the milieu I was in. And my kind of career has kind of gone off from that trajectory. So I've been much more involved in critical theory and the arts. But throughout that, it was illustration that got me interested in this relationship between word and image and how we imagine things in our minds and what that connection is. So that's kind of how I still use it in my teaching. So I want to, is this working? Okay, try this. Okay. So this is quickly going to be in two parts. And I want to start with an anecdote, though, from around 2010. I was the postgraduate theory coordinator at Chelsea College of Art and Design, and I was giving contextual studies lectures to students from graphic design, interior design, fine art, illustration, that were of relevance to all the students. And the idea was that critical contextual studies had value and meaning for all the students. So it was kind of transdisciplinary. So I want to kind of emphasize this transdisciplinary idea, which I think is super important with anything to do with technology and how technology is transforming society, immediately has a transdisciplinary meaning and value. But it was in 2010, it was the first time I was given a talk about information and global information imbalance, because I'd taught media theory for many years at that time too. And in the middle of it, I said something about how not everybody had access to the internet because 25% of the world's population didn't have access to electricity. And that figure was kind of grabbed out of the air for me. And it was the first time a student in the audience Googled that statistic and challenged me that my statistics were out of date. And that was a kind of turning point in my kind of thinking about the relationship between technology and education. And I think it has to do with these questions of trust, which I know is going to be spoken about in a little while. But okay, so I'll go through this two parts. For 20 years, I've been making work around the science fiction writer Philip K. Dick. And for those of you, I'm sure you all know Phil Dick's work, most famous for films like the books that led to films like Total Recall, Minority Report, and Blade Runner. And his work was all about, the relationship between humans and technology, and mainly about the artificial and how humans would be maybe potentially replaced by artificial versions of themselves. But more importantly for Phil, it was about how our relationship to technology actually dehumanizes us. And as the more we work with it, the more we become like it. So his fear was really that we are becoming much more machinic and like machines the more we interact with technology. I could say a lot more about that, but just a little bit about what I've done with that. In 2020, I created a group called the Bug House, which was an international network of artists using the internet to create collaborative artworks. We created a non-binary multi-person author called Jean Meatwar, who led this thing called the Bug House, which was based on the imaginary hospital that Philip K. Dick went to when he had a nervous breakdown in Vancouver. We did a live streamed multimedia performance that took place simultaneously in Vancouver and British Columbia in 2002 called Project Valis. And that community had been working with for a long time. But so we were using digital technology, the internet, in the early 2000s to see how we could use it creatively and collaboratively internationally. More recently, I've been working on a project called the BC Time Slip, again about Philip K. Dick's time in Vancouver. And I won't say too much more about it, but that's kind of where my research is. But the reason why I want to bring this down is that I try to teach from research. But what I find is that the kind of cyber culture, the ideas of the cyber culture that I was very much immersed in the 1990s and early noughties, are kind of already, because students are using technologies every day that are imminent to them, and they've grown up with their DS and And so they're kind of like digital natives. They also, it's very difficult to get them to understand that all these debates have been happening for 40, 50, 60, 70 years, and that people have been discussing them and thinking about the likely impacts of artificial intelligence on society and culture for a long, long time. And one of the problems I have, which I'll speak about, is that there's a kind of technological determinism, a kind of over-valorization of the necessity to use these tools, which of course is a reality for them, but also a kind of a blocking off of the past and of history and all the history that led up to the discussions and the technologies that are happening now. So for those of you, you all probably know the famous scene from Blade Runner, the Voight-Kampff test, which is basically a version of the Turing test. I won't go too much into this. This is a digital simulation of the scene from Blade Runner, where the replicant on the left is being interviewed by the human on the right, being tested whether or not it's a robot. As I say, this is basically a model of the Turing test, which is a basic beginning of artificial intelligence. Alan Turing, whether or not a human could distinguish between responses given by a machine or by a human. And if you couldn't distinguish between the human and the machine, it would pass the Turing test. That's basically what the Voight-Kampff test is a version of. And of course, it's a meme, it's a trope. So it's been used, you know, it's contemporaneously used in memes to talk about this relationship between the human and the artificial human, the human and the AI. It's not quite what was going on in that, but it's the roots of these sorts of debates. Should just say something as well about trying to teach from my research in new wave science fiction, cyberculture of the 90s, Philip K. Dick's work, is that often, like I say, it's seen to be retro because it's from the 70s, 80s, 90s. Where it does seem to have relevance and where I think young people seem to get it is in the question of the anthropomorphization or the personalization of AI and the kind of interpersonal gender-related aspects of you know, all that goes around that, like being misled, being bullied. You know, people might not be who they say they are. This whole question of distinguishing the authentic person from the artificial person is something that I think young people are still generally interested in. This is just an example of recent film where you know, a guy falls in love with an AI, and also Lil Michaela, an entirely simulated artificial influencer on Instagram. So these are ways in which I try to perhaps reach out, but I always feel like an old guy from the 90s trying to reach out to digital natives from the 21st century. And it's quite difficult at times. So I have this teaching device that I use called the intergenerational matrix, which I've devised over the years of teaching. And to cut a long story short, this tries to show that whenever you were born, you go through the same stages. So the axis on the left is the age axis, and everybody's born at 0 and they go through various stages. And in your world, whichever historical period you're in, you're sharing it with people who've gone through the stages you've gone through, but at different periods of time. So it's a way of trying to get students to understand that even though they may be 20 and I may be 50, you know, I have also been 20 once, but when I was 20, it was a different technological environment. So I try to use this to get students to understand that everybody develops along a similar age axis, but they do so in different historical circumstances. And I will, you know, add certain things to that. So here's just a simple example of trying to add some technological information about when things were invented. So personal computer, 1980s, internet. You know, I know they were invented early, but people popularly started to use the internet in the mid-90s. Y2K, 9/11, this very important historical moment where we thought that computers were all going to crash when, you know, year 2000 turned. Didn't happen, but billions of dollars were made on people preparing us for the thing that never happened. There's a lot to be learned from that about the doomerism associated with AI, which has also been reflected on by a lot of writers before then. And then the very, very rapid development of smartphone, Web 2.0, and social media in the noughties. And I just say, you know, kind of full disclosure in a way, my sense is the biggest problem we have is not really with AIs, it's with the dependency of students on mobile phones and tablets, and the fact that they only really engage with world and information largely through those screens. And those impacts psychologically, emotionally, developmentally are for me far more important than the threats of particular kinds of AIs. And as we know, that the kind of the AIs that we're talking about now, which are neural networked AIs, rather than the symbolic logic AIs which were developed in the late 90s, early 90s, of what's led to the kind of the current deep learning phase that we're in, and what the generative AIs are using. Okay, so just to say a little bit about where I am with my Philip K. Dick research, and then I'll move on to projects I'm working with the students. Philip K. Dick had a vision in 1974 where an artificial intelligence, stroke alien intelligence, communicated with him, and he spent the rest of his life trying to account for what happened to him in this thing called the exegesis. In 2021, this book came out by Kayalado McDowell called Pharmaco AI, which was the first one of the first books to be written in relationship to GPT-3. I mean, GPT-3, that was, the earlier version. And I read a review of it by a colleague, Eric Davis, author of Technosis and other books, where he likened Pharmaco AI to the AI that spoke to Philip K. Dick in 1974 and all his reflections on it. And it was reading that review that made me realize that actually it would be really good to try and write a Philip K. Dick book by an AI, with an AI. And so I contacted some colleagues who work for a company called Etic-Lab, which is a digital research company. And I asked them what would need to happen to do that. And they said that basically you would have to feed the AI all the Philip K. Dick books. It would have to be familiar with them. It'd have to know all that. And then it could generate a book for you. And I realized then that, in fact, the last thing I want to do is program an AI with Philip K. Dick books. I would much rather read all those Philip K. Dick books and write the novel myself. So I'm currently writing a novel called BC Time Slip, The Empire Never Ended, under a pseudonymous name, potentially Angel Archer. It's Philip K. Dick pseudonym. But I'm actually taking, and the point here is that I want to take the time to enjoy reading those books and doing that work in my own time without being on a computer all the time, and actually reclaiming the joy of slow creativity. And really, this to me is really, I'm very much a kind of decelerate the process, get off the screens, get off the computers. But that's a very difficult thing to have as an ethical position when all your students are using these devices and these tools all the time and are being encouraged to by everything around them and by the university. So we're really sort of swimming against the tide if we're trying to do that. But I am swimming against the tide while not letting go of all the learning and knowledge about these issues that we have and can share. So on to Midjourney. I have a colleague who's a painter, Theo Bagiotas, and he introduced me to Midjourney, say last year, I think it was. And he'd already been making these paintings that looked kind of like Midjourney. So he was really fascinated that it made images that looked like his paintings. So I went away and played with it, and other parts of my research are to do with Native American indigenous cultures in British Columbia and Haitian voodoo. So I put voodoo ceremony in British Columbia. And these were some of the images that were produced by Midjourney in a few seconds. And I have to say, like so many people, I was completely blown away. And if I was a teenager, I would, which I feel like when I see them, I would just want this, completely high-res poster of this printed up and put on my wall straight away. It'd be like they have a kind of really strong, for me, teen fantasy kind of energy to them, which again, I don't deny that part of myself. So this led me to think I should do work with students on this. So the project I do with students is we have a module in the first year. The research module is called Looking Through Writing. And I have an assignment called Images for Interpretation, sometimes called Visual Translation. And it's about getting students to understand the difference between descriptive and interpretative writing. So what I do for this project is I send every student an image. They don't know what the image is, but it's from art history. In this case, I used images that I knew would be on display in London at the Tate Modern or National Gallery because we were going on a field trip to it. And they had to describe it in 300 words for someone who can't see it using only descriptive language. So it's a descriptive language exercise. They then share those descriptions in class, and their colleagues make drawings based on the descriptions. The person who's made the description then looks at the drawings and chooses the one that is closest to the image. We then look at the original image, which the rest of the students haven't seen before, and we talk about how the language used to describe the image might have been used differently to try and get to hone descriptive language to be more accurate or more consensual, at least. So that's the exercise. We then do a group interpretation where we ask what that image might mean without any art historical or contextualization, just what, from what we can see, the image means. And that's really great because we find out that, in fact, I think our interpretations as a group are as good as anything an art historian might give. I mean, that sounds bold, but it is quite amazing what happens when you do that. And then this year I asked the students to reduce the description to one sentence and then use that one sentence to generate images through Midjourney. So I'll just show you some illustrations of that. So these are 3 examples of the 20 that I shared with the students. Dutch still life, religious painting, and obviously Van Gogh's landscape, which they described and shared with their colleagues. These are some of the drawings that the students did in 5-10 minutes in class. We read the description out and they draw it live in class, and then we share them. And these are the images made by Midjourney on their one sentence descriptions of those works. Now, I don't want to get too far into this, and I'll just say simply that I think we can see what the algorithm has been trained on. So clearly, I think it's already Dutch still lifes have already, the algorithm knows those because these are so similar to the original. The Van Gogh images, probably there's a lot of Van Gogh in there, and probably lots of religious iconologies in there too. What was surprising about the exercise, the workshop, was that the students weren't as blown away as I was, or any of my colleagues have been. And I think this is because they haven't yet learnt the skills or how difficult it is to fabricate and make things. These are first-year students. So they don't really recognize how much time would have gone into making something if you'd had to make it by hand. So for them, it's kind of just, oh, well, yeah, so what? So mostly they were kind of nonplussed about this, which was interesting, but also very different responses. And there were some students who openly, like I think many of us feel, just refused to use the, because they didn't want to set up a, do what was necessary to set it up. It didn't work for them. Their computers weren't, and everybody's using different interfaces. So it brought up all those frustrations about who has access, who understands it, who doesn't understand it. It doesn't do what I want it to do. Those sorts of things came up, but not so much of the wow factor. And I just want to finish with one slide. And going back to the very beginning about 90s cyberculture, it was completely interdisciplinary, that kind of work, the kind of Donna Haraway, Sadie Plans, all the postmodern cultural theory, all that stuff was all about, we have to get out of our kind of disciplinary silos to understand this. And we've known this since cybernetics, because cybernetics was already a completely transdisciplinary movement. But there's some books here that I've been reading. My concern is that we actually, as a community of educators, don't have enough cross-disciplinary communication and don't talk between our disciplines about this issue, which is affecting all of us, whether we teach biology, physics, business, sports, fine art, illustration. And these are some of the books I think we really need to be, some books that are already tackling what's already happening. And again, just finally, I think it's like we really need to look about developmental psychology and how the new technology and the new media environments are affecting people at a much earlier age. Because by the time they arrive as first-year students for us, they've already been transformed quite significantly in the way they work cognitively, and that's what we need to look at. And I'll stop there.